Hello, my name is Marisa Gertz. I call myself Grandma Moses. That was a title actually given to me by a minister that I met with one day, and it kind of stuck. Um, so what I'm doing is I've been, as I said, in the description, I have been loving the teachings of Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. And he is just a wonderful messianic theologian, a TH.D, as well as he knows Hebrew and Greek. And I'm sharing notes from his Bible courses that I've been taking over the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm just going to share those with you. The first one is the background. The first 3 lessons are actually mostly background information that's real important to understand. And it is a compilation of about 4 decades of research and work done by Dr. Fruchtenbaum. And it is a very systematic study. There's a certain clarity that you get when you hear a Jewish theologian, because the Jewish people know how to take it down to just the simplest way, and I enjoy that. I'm very excited to share this with you. So we're going to trace the life of Jesus, Yeshua, based on a harmonization of the 4 Gospels. And this requires Jewish understanding, or else there's misunderstanding. And a messianic Jewish perspective has been missed and is, I think, resurging. So, because that is necessary for understanding certain phrases and certain parts of the Bible, for sure and for certain. And Christian colleges and seminaries only address, many of them, only address New Testament Greek and Roman historical and cultural backgrounds. And that is valuable for certain books of the New Testament, but not for all, right? The life of Jesus doesn't play itself out within the framework of Roman culture, but within Jewish culture, and a specific type of Jewish culture, that of 1st century Israel. And beginning in the 4th century, 400 AD basically, the larger church chose to ignore it. And that's a whole study in and of itself, but it has to do with when Augustine and all that came in. So they downplayed the Jewishness understanding, or somehow they lost it. And as a result, in the course of church history, many church divisions occurred. Many different denominations sprang up over a particular phrase. For instance, to be born of water. Jesus told Nicodemus, you must be born of water and the Spirit. And then he said, can I enter back into my mother's womb and be born again? To be born of water is a Jewish phrase that means a natural birth. The birth process, basically, is to be born of water. So it created a lot of theological confusion. The concept of baptismal regeneration sprung up out of nowhere, meaning you must be water baptized to be saved, because they misunderstood the phrase to be born of water and assumed it meant baptism, but it did not. So the gospel writers, they used Jewish phraseology, Jewish backgrounds, and terms that they didn't bother to explain in the Gospels because they were commonly understood. at that time. But now, 2,000 years later, there is a lack of knowledge in the Christian public today. Jewish studies are virtually non-existent in schools. And so in history, many of these divisions in churches could have been avoided if the Jewish frame of reference had not been ignored. It's a Jewish story in a Jewish context, part of a segment of Jewish history. The methodology of Dr. Fruchtenbaum's teachings, he uses a thematic harmony of the Gospels versus a geographical one, which is what other harmonies use. But the geographical fails to show a correlation, and there's no real connection between the events from beginning to the end of Jesus' 3.5-year ministry. So doing it thematically, and I'll explain how that's going to be done, is important to do, and it will help us understand the sequence of events better. The basic theme, and I love this about how it's opened up my mind to the messianic, that Jesus is the messianic king. The Gospels record the coming of the king, the reactions to the king, and subsequent rejection of the king, the death and resurrection of the king, the departure of the king, and the promise of the return of the king. The issue, and I never saw it this way, is kingship of Jesus. His messianic declarations, his subsequent rejection by the Jewish leadership will be very heavily interrelated with Pharisaic Judaism. So the first major division of the harmonies is the coming of the king, and it begins with the birth narrative. So we're going to look at the birth narrative, then his infancy, his youth, baptism, up to the temptation. And that's when John the Baptist authenticates Jesus. This is the Lamb of God. He doesn't say, this is the Messiah, but he uses a messianic phrase, the Lamb of God. That takes you back to Exodus, where the Passover happened, and the Lamb of God, and the blood of the Lamb of God on the doorposts and the lintels. Number 2, the second division in the harmony is the authentication of the king. Jesus is going to begin to present himself to Israel as the promised Messiah. He authenticates himself over and over again with miracles, signs, and wonders. He goes from city to city, synagogue to synagogue, offering the messianic kingdom to Israel. The messianic kingdom is at hand. His ministry emphasizes his person and his work. He is Jewish Messiah that was prophesied by the Jewish prophets. Secondly, he was offering then and there the kingdom of the Jewish prophets described, so that they would accept him as the messianic king. Had they done that, if they would have accepted him as the messianic person, king, they could have seen the kingdom established in their day. But the setting up of the messianic kingdom required them to accept him as the messianic king, and to authenticate his claims, he performed many miracles, signs, and wonders. And there were certain miracles that could only be done by the Messiah, and we'll talk about that. During that phase, the period of time, the second phase, Jesus, as he just begins his ministry and goes out, he receives opposition from the Pharisees pretty much right off the bat. They begin an investigation of this man because of his messianic claims. They had a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah. And so the Sanhedrin would send a few people just to listen and gather information. Is this worthy of a larger investigation? Phase 2 is when they go in there and they have questions, and they question the person. They kind of interrogate him, so to speak. So that's what they did, and they did that to Jesus. So, but he understood Pharisaic Judaism. Jesus knew the law. He knew the oral law, also known as the tradition of the elders. And interestingly enough, Jesus' style of teaching is similar to the rabbis and what they taught, how they taught. Similar in a sense that, but not totally. He was distinct. Also distinct from them. So, okay. And we'll talk about the types of Judaisms there were in the first century. There was at least 4 different groups of Jewish sect. Now, phase 3 comes the controversy over the king. The leadership of Israel officially send their delegation out. They start questioning Jesus, and they officially reject Jesus because Jesus repudiated, meaning rejected many of their ideas. In fact, they said he was possessed by Beelzebub. And in response, there's a radical turning point in the nature of Jesus' ministry. Once they pass that judgment, he changes his method of teaching, and he goes to parabolic teaching. And we'll get into detail. So this is just an overview today. The 4th phase, so the 3rd phase was the controversy. The 2nd phase was the opposition that he's starting to get. And now 4th phase is, as Jesus is rejected by the leadership of Israel, he turns to his disciples and he begins to train them. He's focused on training them for the works they would be doing after, and the missions they are going to need to fulfill later in the book of Acts. 5th is the opposition to the king grows. Earlier, Jesus was opposed, rejected by Israel's leaders, but now even the common people are swayed by their leaders, and they still are today very much. They reject Jesus as well. Should we follow the old shepherds or the new one? They were described as being sheep without shepherds. But now, slowly, and moving forward, the Pharisees' explanation of his being demonized and him practicing sorcery so as to do the miracles by sorcery, the general common people are swayed. Now, in the 6th section is the preparation of the disciples by the king. This is the final period of his ministry. Jesus begins to clearly declare to his disciples the program of his death and resurrection. Now he's preparing them specifically so they will understand his imminent death and resurrection. At least 4 times that it is recorded But there's even probably more times than that, Jesus explains his program of death and resurrection. And he adds more details each time as he goes on. But each of those times, we are told that the disciples, quote, did not understand. When these things finally happened, they were caught by surprise when Jesus was crucified and died. Section, okay, hold on here. 7, the official presentation of the king. This is when Jesus enters, does the triumphant entry. And this section of the harmony closes with Jesus's stark denunciation of the leaders of Israel. And he lays down the preconditions for his second coming and the return of the Messianic kingdom. Section 8 is the preparation for the death of the king. This section begins with the Olivet Discourse, which contains prophecies near and far of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and his second coming. The Olivet Discourse is followed by his last Passover, the Last Supper, and the Upper Room Discourse, where they talk a lot about stuff. And it concludes with his agony at Gethsemane. That's section 8. Section 9 includes his trial, focuses on the official trial and then the death of the king. And section 10 is the resurrection and ascension of the king and the final training of the apostles. And it concludes with a promise of his return. 40 days post-resurrection ministry. Jesus ministered 40 days after his resurrection to his disciples, and then he ascends, promising to returning only when the leadership of Israel accepts him. That's a precondition for his return. So I'm done with our first teaching, and we will conclude here and just giving a basic outline of the harmony of the Gospels. And we will next we will be discussing some of the history that of Israel and at the time Jesus walked the earth. Thanks, and God bless you.